one of those things that I did want to talk about was Justin Fields. I wanted to talk about Justin Fields on Saturday when we had our draft special recap show, but I decided to not because I felt like I needed more time in deciding how I felt about the Chicago Bears taking Justin Fields at number 11 overall. And obviously Justin Fields being the quarterback out of Ohio State University, and he has been for the longest time considered to be the number 2 prospect right behind Trevor Lawrence, and for one reason or another, for reasons that I'm not quite sure or don't understand, his draft stock plummeted. Plummeted might be a little bit of an extreme. It definitely depreciated during the course of the offseason, and I wasn't necessarily sure why. So he fell out of what at one point seemed like a sure number 2 draft selection to being drafted 11th overall by the Chicago Bears. Chicago, hopefully for them, has their franchise quarterback, and Justin Fields has a home in Chicago. And again, I wasn't necessarily sure how I felt about this pick at first. I think my initial reaction was, I kind of feel bad for Justin Fields. He has that immediate pressure on his shoulders to be successful in Chicago right away with Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy's jobs essentially on the line. And I wouldn't necessarily say that he has the hardest situation going into this next season out of all the rookie quarterbacks that got drafted. I think Trevor Lawrence has work to do. I think Zach Wilson will have work to do with the Jets. Of course, the Jets organizationally have a lot to prove in terms of being able to get over the hump and out of the rut that they've been in for multiple decades now. So I wouldn't necessarily say that Justin Fields has the hardest position out of all the rookie quarterbacks, but I wouldn't also consider Chicago necessarily a good landing spot for Justin Fields in a city and a team in which quarterbacks have recently, and pretty much as long as the Bears have been a team, quarterbacks have gone there to quote-unquote die. So it's a very mixed feeling reaction for me when I first saw that the Chicago Bears traded up. They traded 4 picks away to the New York Giants, which we already talked about Dave Gettleman and how I felt like the Giants had a great draft. They traded away 4 picks to New York to be able to trade up and get Justin Fields. And after, thinking about it for a couple of days, I really kept struggling with the question. I kept asking the question, as I don't know if you can see it, but there's a lot of natural light coming through my room now, so I apologize if the lighting gets out of sorts during the course of the segment. But I was asking myself, as on cue, right? I kept asking myself, can Justin Fields really be the franchise quarterback in Chicago? And obviously, it's a little bit of a silly question at this point because there's always a chance, right? I mean, even on a completely sunny day here in Florida, there is always a chance of rain. That's just the life we live. Ask any Floridian, there's always a chance of rain. And similarly, there's always a chance that the guy that you draft to be your franchise quarterback actually works out. And, I've kind of, taken some time to lay out a couple of reasons as to why or why not Fields can be the guy in Chicago. And I keep coming back to this point that kind of reassures me that Justin Fields has a genuine chance of being the first true franchise quarterback for Chicago, at least in the last 40 years or so. If there's any quarterback in this draft class that has faced adversity the most, I would argue that it's Justin Fields. And this is arguably the toughest situation out of any of the top QB situations heading into this year. As I said, I wouldn't necessarily, it's the toughest, but it is one of the toughest. And Justin Fields is tough. He's always been second fiddle to Trevor Lawrence. He's never been considered the top guy. So I imagine that Justin Fields probably plays with a gigantic chip on his shoulder. And he left Georgia after Georgia committed to Jake Fromm in his senior year. So he was beaten out by Jake Fromm in Georgia, went to Ohio State, played 2 seasons, and went to the semifinal and the championship game. And in most recent history, he absolutely torched the Clemson Tigers through for 6 touchdowns, 350 plus yards. And he did so for half of the game, having a gigantic rib injury, I believe, or maybe it was a hip pointer, something along those lines. He played fantastic in arguably such horrific adversity to be able to take that type of hit, a hit in which the tackler actually got eliminated from the game because it was so bad, to come back out and still lead your team. So Justin Fields has shown me toughness, he showed me grit, he showed me confidence, and that's something that you will need in Chicago. And again, him being second fiddle to Lawrence all these years, him being second fiddle to Fromm in Georgia, and him having to go Ohio State to actually get the playing time and the recognition that he's deserved as a prospect, I think Justin Fields plays with that confidence and that edge on his shoulder that he will need to be successful in Chicago. So I'm optimistic about that. And I think that in terms of the play calling and the playbook situation that he's going to go into, I would have loved him with Shanahan in San Francisco, but with Matt Nagy in Chicago, I think he also has a really good situation. He's going to be used in a very similar fashion to the way that Mitchell Trubisky was used, but he might be able to make better decisions than Trubisky, and that's the big question. What's the biggest con in terms of being talked about when it comes to Justin Fields in his prospect and his scouting report? Is that he doesn't make decisions that well, or he's going to have trouble adjusting to the speed of making adjustments in the NFL. That's kind of the only negative when it came to his scouting report, and that's the one big problem that Mitchell Trubisky had in Chicago, apart from a glaring confidence issue. So he's going to be used similar to Trubisky. He's a similar athlete to Trubisky. I think Justin Fields is faster. I think he's better built than Trubisky is, but he's going to be used similarly to Trubisky in Chicago. And again, the biggest problem and the biggest hump in the road that I can foresee is an issue in which the decision making is very, very similar to Trubisky, and he doesn't make that leap to being a better decision maker. That's something that does scare me. But on the other hand, and on the bright side, Justin Fields, I don't think, will have the confidence issues that Trubisky developed in his time in Chicago. And part of that reason is because Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy never really agreed, or at least it appeared they never really agreed on Trubisky as the starting quarterback. Trubisky looked fine, his opening year. I think they went 12-4 and went to the playoffs where they lost. But after that, when the question started rolling around and coming in on whether Trubisky was the guy, it never really seemed like the coaching staff and the general manager were in agreement on who the starting quarterback should be, whether that would have been Foles or Trubisky or whoever have you. I don't think Justin Fields is going to have that problem in Chicago this time around, not only because this is Matt Nagy's selection and this is Ryan Pace's selection together, but because I think he has a stronger mental than Trubisky ever had. And that's one thing that Barris will tell you straight away, is that's the fact that the confidence issues that came from Trubisky came from the fact that Matt Nagy didn't actually draft Trubisky. A lot of people will say, oh, well, Matt Nagy drafted Trubisky and, he didn't work out. That's not true. Ryan Pace drafted Trubisky. Matt Nagy was actually part of the Chiefs staff that drafted Patrick Mahomes. So you would have to think that Matt Nagy understands the good qualities of a quarterback and that he likes what he sees in Justin Fields, and the fact that Justin Fields fell to them at 11 was enough for him to tell Ryan Pace, hey, let's go get this guy. So that's kind of some pros and cons that I've been weighing in my head over the past couple of days. I do worry that he will have coaching problems and that he will be one of those quarterbacks that never truly finds a consistent system, because the reality is that there's a very real chance that Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy might lose their jobs anyways this season. So I do have concerns that those two will lose their jobs, and Justin Fields will be one of those players that can never find a consistent coach and consistent offensive coordinator or consistent GM, and there will be a struggle to build around Fields, especially in a year in which it feels like Chicago needs to make the playoffs. It needs to win a game in the playoffs in order for that to not happen. So it's a crucial year for Chicago. So again, something to keep in mind, Matt Nagy drafted Mahomes and then went to Chicago, so Trubisky wasn't his guy. This is Justin Fields is more or less Nagy's guy. This is the one that he's laying his job out on the line for, essentially. So that's kind of what's been going through my mind. I know that was a little bit disoriented, but that's literally been the cogwheel that's been my mind when I'm thinking about Justin Fields in Chicago. I'm really interested to see what you guys are thinking, what you guys think about Justin Fields going to Chicago, and if he has a good chance to succeed. Hey folks, thank you so much for listening to this segment from the Hard-Headed Sports Podcast. If you enjoyed this segment, make sure that you drop a like on the video and a comment. It helps me out a bunch. And if you're interested in watching more segments like this from the show after the show has been completed, you should definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you're interested in listening to the entire show in its full-length entirety, you should listen to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Anchor. Once again, thank you so much for watching the video. My name is Nick Ryan, and I will see you all again very soon.
Yeah.